Hey there, welcome back to another video. This time it is a review of a fairly obscure film, the 1972 disaster thriller Skyjacked. Now, this is a film that I didn't really know that much of. I didn't really know it was even a film that existed until I saw it at this DVD at a thrift store a few months ago. And I was like, this might be alright. And I realized it was a Warner Archive release, and these are usually pretty pricey. So, for like a couple bucks, I thought it was worth a shot. Um, and it's got a pretty good cast. I mean, you have Charlton Heston, Yvette Mimieux, James Brolin, very young James Brolin, Jeanne Crain in her last film role, Walter Pidgeon, Susan Day in her acting debut, and Leslie Uggams. And also, Nicholas Hammond has a bit role in this as the senator's son. And you might recognize Nicholas Hammond as the actor who went on to play Peter Parker Spider-Man in the 70s live-action TV series The Amazing Spider-Man. Now, this is directed by John Guillermin, who would go on to direct King Kong, as well as a few other films. And this came out around the same time as a lot of these other disaster movies of the 70s, The Poseidon Adventure. Actually, I think The Poseidon Adventure came out after this. I could be wrong, though. I know Earthquake came out after this. And this was in the vein of those disaster films and also in the vein of those airport movies, because I think Airport, it came out in 1970, I believe, so that came out before this. And this was actually a pretty big hit when it came out in theaters in 1972. It was made for a budget of about $1.7 million, which in 1972 is quite a bit of money, and it made $6 million in the US and Canada. So it was actually a pretty profitable film. In fact, it was one of MGM's biggest hits of 1972, along with Shaft and Kansas City Bomber. But despite that, it's just fallen through the cracks. It's a film that barely nobody talks about. Nobody really seems to remember it that much. It doesn't really seem to be fondly remembered by many people. And I don't quite get it, because compared to Airport, this is a much better movie. I actually like this more than any of the Airport films, even the ones that are so bad they're good, like Concorde, Airport 79, and so on and so forth. Um, this one really surprised me. I thought it was a solid thriller. It was a nice old-fashioned, small-scale whodunit on an airliner. So that most of the film is trying to figure out who's the one who is trying to skyjack the plane. And yes, I did figure out who it was like very early on, which was a problem, and that did hurt it did hurt my overall view of the film a little bit, but it wasn't enough for me to totally disregard the film entirely, because even though I figured out the identity of the skyjacker, spoilers, it's James Brolin, who plays a psychotic former army vet. Even though I figured it out, it was still worth it in the end, because James Brolin's performance was so great. He really did a phenomenal job playing this Section 8 former military vet who came out of Vietnam and had severe PTSD, and thought that if he skyjacked this plane and forced it to go to Russia, to Moscow, then maybe he can actually get work there as a Russian soldier if he gives some intel to the Russians and gives them the senator in return, and this FBI agent who snuck on board. But he quickly finds out that the Russians don't want to deal with his crazy ass either. But I just thought that was really a nice change of pace to have like a backstory for the skyjacker that actually is quite tragic and really shows how the military just used people back then and still does to this day. And once they're no longer able to work, they're no longer able to serve their country, they're just either tossed aside, and the military gives no, they don't give in. It seems like they don't give any fucks, and they don't apologize for their role in what happened either. They're just like, nope, you can't work for us anymore. You're damaged goods. We're gonna send you to an institution, or we're just gonna send you home broken. And it's just one of the, it's really a bummer. And I felt the film did a pretty decent job showing that dynamic. Now, I thought it was also pretty clever the way that they showed his psychosis, and he'd have these sort of hallucinations every now and then. When there's cameramen with flash bulbs, he would have a flashback to when he came home from Vietnam, and then there was another one where he ended up near the end where he's imagining that he's gonna have this warm welcome by the Russians, but it quickly turns sour. And I like how surreal this scene is, because it's a carbon copy of the scene that he remembers from his own memory from when he came home, with the same people and everything, but instead of the American flag, they're holding the Soviet flag, and instead of American soldiers, they're Soviet soldiers. And instead he's smiling, he's expecting them to shake his hand and congratulate him, and they just stand there still, and they don't do any of that. They don't even shake his hand. And that's when his psychosis is broken, and he realizes that he's being surrounded by Soviets with guns. So that was a really nice touch there. And speaking of there's a lot of nice touches in this film. For one, I feel Guillermin's direction is top notch, especially for the time. He does a great job with these tight and closed, cramped spaces. In a film like this, it can be kind of difficult to shoot because you don't really have a lot of space, because you're shooting it in tight cockpits, or you're shooting it in the tight, cramped confines of the passenger coach, or I don't think it's coach, but the passenger section of the plane, and first class, and so on and so forth. They focus on first class though most of the time, because that's where the main cast is. I don't blame them, because in a film like this, you can only have so many characters. And I also really like that John not only did a good job handling all of this and finding his way around all these tight, cramped corners, but he also did some fancy stuff every now and then. He had some camera work that was really creative. Had the camera tilt a little bit, some different sort of pans, and so on and so forth. So overall, yeah, I was really impressed by his direction. Another thing I was really impressed with was the cinematography, especially during the flight sequences. It was really refreshing to see a film where a majority of the sequences in the air are all real. They're real planes. It's a real Boeing 707. The Russian MiGs that show up later in the film, when the 707 ends up in Russian airspace, they're not real MiGs. They are actually F-100 jets in Russian camo, but it was still nice to see that it was still a real jet though. They were real planes. There was a sequence, I believe. There was a sequence later in the film where it was quite suspenseful, where Charlton Heston is the pilot and he's trying to figure out where this small plane is that's in the general vicinity, and he doesn't know where it is because he has almost zero visibility because there's clouds everywhere. I think some of it might have been done with a model, but I think a lot of it was done for real. Like an actual Boeing 707 just swerved and narrowly avoided a small passenger plane. This is the kind of stuff that you do not see nowadays. It's done with CGI or with models. And so that was really nice. It was really refreshing to see that. And also, they really couldn't have done CGI back in 1972, or models really, because they weren't really as realistic or as well put together as they would be later in the decade and in decades afterwards. So yeah, the film's written by John Guillermin. It's written by Stanley R. Greenberg. It's adapted from a novel by David Harper called Hijacked. The script I thought was pretty good. I felt it ran out of steam a little bit. It tailed off near the end of the film once the identity of the Skyjacker is revealed. Um, but it had some nice touches here and there. I like the bits of character development for Charlton Heston's character, for Yvette Mimieux's character. Um, I like the fact that it had the whodunit aspects. I like how they did that with the Skyjacker leaving cryptic messages in the plane, trying to get them to divert their course to Anchorage, Alaska. Some nice, fun bits of witty dialogue. Some nice, badass lines for Charlton Heston to say. I also felt that the traffic control dialogue was actually pretty snappy. It wasn't as boring as it normally is in these type of movies. And in terms of the script, I also really liked other sort of elements. Like, you find out later in the film that James Brolin's character never really actually had a bomb. He just had a bunch of grenades and some guns. He never really ever had a bomb on board. It was all a ploy. It was all a fake. So, and that was a nice touch, because normally it's just quite predictable in that way. You're like, oh, it's he had a bomb the whole time. They got to try to find the bomb, throw it off the plane, blah 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 blah. But that's not what happens in this film. It ends up with a confrontation in Russia. I didn't see that coming at all. So I definitely want to give kudos to the screenwriter for that. It's a slow-paced film. It takes a bit to get going. It's not action-packed. It's not that type of movie, though. It's more of a slow-burn thriller, old-fashioned whodunit, trying to figure out who the Skyjacker is. Despite that, though, I felt it moved at a pretty good pace. It was only 101 minutes, so it wasn't over 2 hours. Even Charlton Heston himself thought that was a nice thing, because normally he does a lot of films that are epics and over 2 hours. So he was like, it was a pleasure for a change to be in a film that runs under 2 hours. Now, the film not only features Charlton Heston, but also has Yvette Mimieux, has Angela Thatcher. I thought both of them did really good. Charlton Heston is very trying to think of the right word for him. Like, he's such a grizzled actor, and he performed with the ability of a grizzled vet. I really did like his performance in this. He was as cantankerous as always, and he was actually quite believable in this role as this hard-nosed pilot, Captain Henry Hank O'Hara. Yvette Mimieux was absolutely gorgeous as Angela Thatcher, and I also felt that her performance was also really solid too. She was more than just a pretty face. James Brolin delivered one of his best performances that I've personally seen as the Section 8 military man, Jerome K. Weber. Claude Akins was fine as Sergeant Ben Puzo. Jeanne Crain was there. Susan Day. She was just... She wasn't given too much to do, but she did find what she had to work with. Rosie Grier in his acting debut was a lot of fun as Gary Brown. Mariette Hartley, she was Walter Pidgeon was in fine form as Senator Arn Linder. And Leslie Uggams, I also really liked as Lovejoy Wells. I thought she was a really spunky character, and I thought she delivered a very spunky performance. Nicholas Hammond, he was fine. It was nice to see him in something else, but he really did not have that much to work with, and really didn't have that many scenes. It seems like he was just there to be a love interest for Susan Day's character. And yeah, I don't really know what else to say about Skyjacked. Yeah, except apparently Charlton Heston reportedly took the lead role so that MGM would allow him to use footage from Ben-Hur, the 1959 film, for his directorial debut, Antony and Cleopatra. Which, Bill Murray only did Ghostbusters, so Columbia could finance his film, The Razor's Edge. So, sometimes that stuff happens, and it's not like he sleepwalked through his role and it was a bad performance. So I think it was a good trade off, so to speak. So I don't really know what else to say about Skyjacked. It's a very straightforward film. Who done it on a plane, trying to figure out who the Skyjacker is. There's your typical sort of dramas that happen on board. There's even a gal who's pregnant. You have the whole trying to figure out who might have the bomb. Charlton Heston's character, Hank, trying to figure out what to do next. And then once the Skyjacker is revealed, then it's this race to the finish, basically, to try to stop him, for one, and try to get everybody off the plane safely, and try not to get shot out of the sky by the Russian Air Force. So, yeah, it was a nice little film. I know for back then it was probably a big picture, but when you compare it to a lot of films nowadays, it is quite quaint. But that being said, even though there are some aspects of it that are dated, like the wardrobe and some of the other aspects of it, I mean, for one, you're not going to be able to bring a carry-on full of grenades and weapons nowadays. That's for sure. But in a day and age where we are really very paranoid about terrorism on planes and things like that, this actually holds up quite well because of the fact that it's not really terrorists. It's not your typical sort of terrorist plot with the hijacking. It's something different entirely. It's this Section 8 military man who feels like he was scorned by his government and thinks that if he does this wild act, that another government and the Russians will welcome him with open arms. So, yeah, I would say definitely check this out if you're a fan of the 70s disaster films, if you like Charlton Heston, and if you think the idea sounds interesting to you. Definitely give it a watch. Oh, and also if you're a fan of James Brolin, because this is definitely one of his better performances. Also, he's so young in this that you can totally see his son Josh in his performance in this. He's almost unrecognizable because he's so young. So that was fun to see him in a role like this as well, because he normally doesn't do this kind of role anyway. He didn't really do this kind of role after. He usually played a lot of hero characters. So it was quite refreshing to see James Brolin stretch his acting muscle so early in his career and show that he's very capable of doing so with a crazed performance. So, yeah, I don't know what else to say about Skyjacked, except if I were to rate it out of 5 stars, I would give the movie 3.5 out of 5. Above average, entertaining, old school disaster thriller that, in my opinion, didn't crash and burn on the tarmac. It was like I said, fairly entertaining movie that went at a good pace, had a good cast of characters, solid direction, and a overall plot that, yeah, at times it doesn't quite work as well as it could, and tails off at the end, but for the most part is still quite effective. So anyway, thank you for watching, and as always, I will see you later. See ya.